Good morning, this is Jim Williams with the Hurricane City Tropical Update for September 13th around 7 a.m. Here's the 2-day graphical tropical weather outlook from the National Hurricane Center in Miami. We have an Invest 93L that has just moved inland in the central Florida coastline. I'll show you that in just a minute. Tropical storm Ian is in the middle of the Atlantic moving north. This will not be affecting any land masses, and we have a new tropical wave coming off Africa, and that system will eventually probably find its way into the open Atlantic as well. Here is a look at the water vapor loop of the entire Atlantic basin, and it's really unfavorable out there, folks. There are upper level lows everywhere in the Atlantic basin. And for example, if you look here in the Gulf of Mexico, here's one upper level low trough moving into the Gulf with westerly wind shear. We have another one here right near Ian causing wind shear, and we have another one out in the East Atlantic drifting off to the southwest, and that is also going to cause wind shear for our new tropical wave moving off Africa. So things are not that favorable in the Atlantic basin at all. In fact, there's a low center in the eastern Gulf that moved south of Florida a couple days ago, and that's being sheared to death by westerly winds on the backside of this trough. So this is not going to develop in the Gulf of Mexico, even though it's a good low-level circulation. Ian over here, on the other hand, being sheared to death, and this might still be able to survive, but look, with all these upper-level lows, it's really tough for these systems to get going, to rise up into the atmosphere, get a high pressure aloft, and develop. So it's unlikely that any of these would have a chance to be a hurricane under these conditions. This morning's weather tap radar from the state of Florida is showing the low-level circulation from Invest 93L right near Melbourne, Florida. The system came in this morning real early, winds out of the east around 20 to 30 miles per hour. So this was probably not a depression, but close to it. But there's the circulation right there. It's going to continue to move inland through the next day or two, and then mainly north. It might sneak into the Gulf, but it's looking like this is unlikely to develop, especially with this westerly wind shear moving in here like this. This is unlikely, but it's a lopsided system, and all that rain is going to move into Florida over the next 24 to 36 hours, and then it'll lift off to the north. But this will not develop. This is the end of 93L, but it is a circulation that has moved on shore in Florida this morning. So the inventory so far this hurricane season, you can see we've had one major hurricane in the Atlantic, and that was Gaston in late August. Became a major hurricane well east of Bermuda as it headed out to sea. And then we had Hermine make landfall in Appalachia Bay, and we had Earl make landfall in Belize. Both of those were Category 1s. But look at the Pacific, just cranking them out left and right. Hawaii's been threatened several times, but quite a difference between the East Pacific and the Atlantic. So it makes you wonder what's going on out there. I'll have my final thoughts on that at the end of this update video. Our last landfalling hurricane was September 2nd, Appalachia Bay. Hurricane Hermine hit with 80-mile-per-hour winds. But there was a lot of discussion online about which models perform the best, the GFS versus the Euro, blah, 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 blah. You know, the European always does well, it seems like, when it matters. The GFS does well on long tracking systems that are not very well organized. But when it was all said and done, the UK Met outperformed both of these models. But even better than that was the OFCL, which is the best track data at the National Hurricane Center. The forecasters, they did the best job, basically taking all the data from the models and then making their own forecast based on the data that they receive, and they were off by 136.4 miles over a 5-day period on average. The UK Met was off by 160, and then look at the top there, the GFS off by 209, and the European off by 222. So the GFS slightly outperformed the Euro on the overall track of this system, but when it mattered, the European model did have a better track or beat on this becoming a hurricane at landfall in the Panhandle, whereas the GFS had it as a tropical storm. However, again, I have to emphasize showing you this graphic. The OFCL, the official forecast from the National Hurricane Center, usually has the best track and beat on all of these systems. Now, looking at the intensity errors on this system, the GFS did not do as well as the European model. In fact, Euro cut it in half at 5.9 knots off over 5 days, and the GFS was off at 12.4. But again, you look at the bottom, the official was only off by 6.8. The UK Met was off by 9.2 knots. But the European was the best performer, 5.9 knots on her mean for the intensity forecast. Even though the European was not that great out in the open Atlantic, I think the GFS did outperform it out in the open Atlantic when it was Invest 99L. But it's important to pay attention to the official forecast from the National Hurricane Center because they take all this data and they were pretty off by only 6.8 knots. If you'd like to know more about this, I have a blog on the front page of Hurricane City at the top of the page with a link to you can read it and find out all the information about how the models performed. And also on the news and blogs page, the latest blogs that I produce are located there as well. We are at the climatological peak of the Atlantic hurricane season, and you can see the development regions in red would indicate that the majority would be in maybe the Gulf of Mexico, a little bit east of the northern Leeward Islands, but basically just about anywhere in the Atlantic basin at this time of the year can have development. And the prevailing tracks would indicate that just about anybody is vulnerable at this time of the year, but then it quickly changes as we head into late September into October. That this will shrink towards the west, and it'll be mainly the western basin that you're going to see development. NOAA's prevailing tracks for October indicate that the most likely place would be the western Caribbean Sea, where all the heat content is piling up at the moment. So we have a long way to go. October is the busiest month for the state of Florida, by the way. So don't let anybody tell you September. October is the prime month for hurricane hits in the state of Florida. So we'll have to keep an eye on it. Now, that does not clear anybody else, even the western Gulf of Mexico, although it's not very likely in the western Gulf of Mexico. The primary areas between Hispaniola, the Yucatan Peninsula, and draw the line north, and that's your most highly threatened area, as well as Bermuda. Why are systems struggling so much in the Atlantic basin compared to the Pacific? Well, in a nutshell, we have a much smaller basin and smaller opportunities for systems to get their act together. But with all these upper level lows caused by these dips in the jet stream, climatologists have said we're going to see much sharper dips in jet streams in the future due to climate change, and that could be affecting the Atlantic basin. I mean, you put all these wave patterns in through a very small window for opportunity, along with dry air coming off Africa, which tends to feed these upper level lows, I think is the reason that we're not seeing more robust systems in the Atlantic basin. And this is something we're going to have to look forward to in the future. Not to say we won't see majors in the Atlantic, it's just that they're not going to be as plentiful with these large dips in the jet stream. Of course, you have troughs coming off the United States, which also cause wind shear. But I am not a meteorologist. Those are just my thoughts on what could be causing the disruption in the Atlantic basin. I'll leave it to the experts that are climatologists to figure this all out. But in a tight, smaller basin like the Atlantic, you need larger expanses of high pressure ridges and a lot less upper level lows and wind shear for development. So we'll see if this is a trend or if it's just something temporary that maybe we're still learning about. Anyway, if we take a final look at the 2-day graphical tropical weather outlook, it looks like Ian's just going to move off into the North Atlantic and could maybe become a hurricane, but it's looking unlikely due to the wind shear from that upper level low. And again, we have a long way to go this season, folks. Don't let your guard down. October is a very active month of the hurricane season. Right now, we're just in a temporary break where we're going between the seasons of African waves making their way all the way across to transitioning to development closer to home in the United States. Anyway, that's it for now. Thank you for watching. I'll be back maybe in a week or so if activity picks up in the Atlantic basin. I'm Jim Williams. Thank you for watching.